Let me ask you something nobody in Washington will ever say out loud. What if 2020 wasn't just a crisis, but a stress test? A quiet experiment to see exactly how much control Americans would tolerate if the government pushed hard enough. Because when you look back at it now, the lockdowns, the mandates, the restrictions, the checks in the mail, none of that was just policy. That was data collection, behavioral data, compliance data. And the real question isn't, did it work? The real question is, what did they learn about us? I continue to believe that 2020 was a massive experiment to determine just exactly how much control the American people would allow over their lives. And tucked inside all that chaos was a little trial run of universal basic income. Not by name, of course, but by function. A test to see how people behave when the government starts paying them directly. Do they stay home? Do they comply? Do they get comfortable? Do they become dependent? And maybe the most uncomfortable part is this. The results of that experiment are still being analyzed. Now, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to point out the patterns that nobody seems to want to talk about. Because if you zoom out, 2020 wasn't just a moment. It was a blueprint. It showed exactly how fast people will trade autonomy for safety. It showed how quickly fear can override skepticism. It showed how easily the average person will accept new rules, new norms, new limits, as long as they're told it's for the greater good. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Think about how fast everything changed. One week, you're living your normal life, and the next week, you're being told where you can go, who you can see, what you can do, what you can buy, and whether your job is essential. That word alone, essential, was a psychological lever. It created a hierarchy overnight. It told millions of people that their work, their livelihood, their purpose was suddenly optional. And then right on cue, the checks started arriving. A little financial cushion to soften the blow, a little taste of what a government-issued safety net feels like. And here's the thing, some people loved it, some people hated it, but almost everyone accepted it. That's the part that matters because acceptance is the metric. Acceptance is the data point. Acceptance is what tells policymakers how far they can go next time. Now, if you're someone who leans conservative, you probably looked at all of this and thought, hold on, this is not how America is supposed to operate, because the conservative instinct is to question government expansion, to push back on overreach, to defend personal responsibility, and to resist the idea that Washington should be the default problem solver for every crisis. And in 2020, that instinct was treated like a problem. Skepticism was treated like defiance. Asking questions was treated like disloyalty. That alone should tell you something. Because in a healthy society, skepticism is a feature. It's not a bug. It's what keeps power in check. It's what prevents temporary emergencies from becoming permanent policies. But in 2020, skepticism was punished. And that punishment was part of the experiment. It showed how social pressure, media pressure, and political pressure could be used to enforce compliance without ever passing a law. That's a powerful lesson for any government to learn. And let's talk about the media for a moment, because if 2020 was a stress test, the media was the lab assistant. They amplified fear. They magnified division. They framed every disagreement as a moral failing. They turned neighbors into enemies and questions into conspiracies. And the more chaotic things became, the more power centralized at the top. That's not an accident. That's a pattern. Look at how quickly people were conditioned to accept phrases like new normal. That phrase wasn't descriptive. It was prescriptive. It was telling you to stop expecting your old life back. It was telling you to adjust your expectations downward. And millions of people did, not because they wanted to, but because they were told it was the responsible thing to do. And then there's the economic side of this. When the government starts sending out checks, even temporarily, it changes the relationship between the citizen and the state. It creates a dependency loop. It creates an expectation. And once that expectation exists, it's very easy for future leaders to say, well, we did it before, we can do it again. That's how temporary programs become permanent fixtures. Now, I'm not saying every politician sat in a room plotting this out. I'm saying that once a government learns what people will tolerate, that knowledge doesn't disappear. It gets used, it gets referenced, it gets baked into future decisions. And if you think the idea of universal basic income is gone, it's not. It's sitting on a shelf waiting for the next crisis big enough to justify pulling it back out. And here's where the conservative perspective becomes important, because conservatives tend to look at government programs through the lens of long-term consequences. They ask, what happens when people get used to this? What happens when the government becomes the default provider? What happens when personal responsibility gets replaced with institutional dependency? Those questions matter, and 2020 gave us a preview of the answers. We saw what happens when people are told to stay home and rely on government checks. We saw what happens when small businesses are shut down while big corporations stay open. We saw what happens when the government decides which jobs matter and which ones don't. And we saw what happens when people start to believe that the government, not their own effort, is the key to their survival. That's not the America most of us grew up believing in. That's not the America built on grit, independence, and personal agency. That's a different model entirely. And once you've seen that model in action, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. So the question now is whether we learned anything. Did we walk away from 2020 more aware of how quickly our freedoms can shrink, or did we walk away more comfortable with the idea that the government can step in and take care of us when things get rough? Because those two mindsets lead to very different futures. I'm not here to tell you which future is right. I'm here to remind you that the last one didn't happen by accident. It happened fast, it happened broadly, and it happened with a level of public compliance, I think, that shocked even the people enforcing it. And if we don't talk about that, if we don't acknowledge what actually happened, then we're basically agreeing to let the next version of it unfold the exact same way. So yeah, I think 2020 was a test. I think it was a trial run. And whether it worked is still yet to be determined. But the next time something big happens, something disruptive, something chaotic, something that shakes the country, you better believe the lessons from 2020 are going to be applied. The only question is whether we'll recognize it when it starts. The government's got the data. The question is whether or not we were paying attention to what they collected.